Hello，大家好，欢迎来到魔兽世界木桩擂台赛特别篇。不知道大家还记不记得，在第二届木桩擂台，我们各个专精的选手们都表达了一些想对设计师说的话，而我们暴雪设计师也在观看了选手们的精彩木桩视频后，发来了自己的观后感，还有对选手的一个问题反馈。那么我们来看一看设计师是如何看待当前版本的各个职业的吧。
Hey, my name is Morgan Day. I'm one of the associate game directors on World of Warcraft, and I'm really excited to get to talk about and commentate on this Mythic Plus dungeon event and target dummy challenge. It sounds like a really awesome and exciting event, so it'll be really cool to see the results of it. Walkers have gone through quite the journey this update with Undermined. I know they were really strong out the gates. There was a ton of representation in raids in the race world first, and they've had quite a bit of tuning done to them, so they bring a lot of awesome utility as, evokers just generally have a lot of great utility, but then also their AoE DPS is quite impressive, especially in burst situations. So that's really cool to see, and not surprising to see them up there in the mix. And then Arms Warriors looks like they're a little bit behind, and I'm not even seeing Fury Warriors on here either at the moment. I know a lot of warriors will swap based on what's essentially performing the best in Mythic Plus at the moment. And yeah, warriors have a decent amount of utility, right? They've got a good amount of control, like things like stuns, and they have some survivability, like with Rallying Cry. But and they do bring their attack power buff, and I know often class comps, especially in Mythic Plus, are very kind of dependent on the buffs that you can bring. Like we saw a lot of Dragonflight compositions focused on casters, specifically because a lot of those buffs. So usually when the melee compositions are really strong, you'll see a lot of representation with warriors if they're tuned to be really valuable. But looks like right now our meta is leaning a bit more on the caster side, with the exception of marksman hunters that just got the big rework, are doing quite well, and they also bring a lot of utility. So interesting to see where warriors are. That's definitely something that the team and I have talked about a bit in terms of like what kind of cool utility could we give a warrior. Obviously a warrior like battle resing would be kind of hilarious. Like, what do they just shout at the dead person? Like, how do they bring them back to life? What's the fantasy of that? But for sure there's been conversations around that kind of group utility. Like you're talking about how Devastation evokers bring bloodlust, which is really valuable on top of the other cool utility they have. So for sure something that the team is going to keep an eye on as the season progresses and as we go into season 3. Yeah, Elemental Shaman is a fun one to discuss. They have a lot of fun tools and utility that they bring to the table, especially with a lot of the affixes that we're seeing. Things like Purge have a lot of value. Some of the dispels that they can bring to the table are also really valuable. And not to mention, holy moly, is Shaman AoE damage, Elemental Shaman AoE damage, really strong. Although I know, doing Mythic Plus groups, I play with the Elemental Shaman often, and anytime the tank has to move, they're like, my Earthquake, no! So losing your AoE damage. I know this was done, a lot of this testing or a lot of this competition was done on target dummies, and target dummies don't move. So, hey, it works out really well for this context. And in terms of single target damage, yeah, that's definitely something where we discuss a lot about what our class's strengths and weaknesses, what is the total package they bring to the table, and ultimately as designers and as game developers, we want to make sure that we are challenging players with enough interesting options and opportunities within the content to make sure that those strengths and weaknesses feel really relevant. It's not fun to have a strength that is barely ever tested in content, and AoE versus single target is a big part of that conversation that we have. So Elemental Shaman AoE has been great, but single target sounds like it was a little bit behind. But on the bright side, hopefully you've seen it by now, there are some pretty significant single target Elemental Shaman buffs, most recently in the 11.15 hotfix notes. I want to say it was around a 5% buff to single target damage, maybe 4 or 5%. So pretty significant changes there. And hopefully that brings you about up to par for people, or for what your expectations might be, especially given the strengths of their AoE damage. Yeah, Warlock is another fun one. I will absolutely talk to the combat team and look at the left side of the general talent tree. That's a fair point. I know that there's always a constant evaluation of kind of what the talent trees are bringing, and the group is constantly looking to kind of add more clarity, add more unique options to those spaces. So for sure, we can take a look at the talent trees. And in terms of buffs, yeah, there's still a handful of classes that don't bring your traditional raid buff, like Death Knights and Warlocks are kind of the two that I believe don't have a traditional raid buff, but ultimately we feel like they have such unique and interesting utility. With Death Knights, they have Death Grip, and Warlocks, you've got Hellstones and Gateway. There's so many unique essentially skips in Mythic Plus that you can do or are enabled to do if you have gateways. I was just playing a bit last night, and there's some real let's just call them unique ones in the Motherlode that I'm like, oh, okay, cool. That's fun to have. And then Hellstones are very much a powerful option for utility, having that huge extra burst heal. It's almost like an extra defensive cooldown for the whole group. You often hear raid leader says use your Hellstones now, right? The same way that you might say, hey, use a big defensive cooldown now. So we feel like those have a lot of value. And honestly, at the end of the day, I would almost wish there was a world where we could have so many cool and unique utility options like Healthstones, like Death Grip, where we didn't need quite as many raid buffs. Raid buffs feel like they're a really easy way to make it so that those classes feel like they're required, but things that are a lot more fantasy forward, like Hellstones, are something that the team loves to discuss, and if there's ways to add more of those. In terms of the kind of damage of the different Warlock specs, I know also the team is constantly doing adjustments to the live game in terms of looking at the balance, and it's a pretty consistent cadence. We try to make sure that there's always an opportunity to look at how our live balance is doing right around the corner. And I know I mentioned some buffs that recently happened with other specs, but I want to say Demonology got some single target buffs recently as well. I think in that 4 to 5% range, which is pretty big. That's like on the upper side of things when we want to do those buffs. So that's something where we like to make adjustments there, but we never really want to throw the overall balance too far out of whack. We don't want a class that was maybe in the bottom half to suddenly be number one by a huge margin. So when we're doing those live balance changes, we try to be a little bit conservative, because we know we can always make adjustments in the future as well. But as it always is, game design and also combat and class design is an art, and we're always looking to update it and make adjustments based on community feedback and just based on the data that we're seeing coming out of the live environments. Yeah, Rep Paladin, and Paladin generally is an extremely popular class. Actually, I think it's one of, if not our most popular class, certainly up there with Hunters and Paladins. And in terms of just kind of that idea of skill expression and having a very high floor, that's very much by design. Ret has only one DPS spec, so something that we talk about a lot is that a lot of those classes that have really high expressions in terms of its high skill ceiling for expressions, those specs are often on classes that have multiple DPS roles. Or if you think about a class like Paladins, so Retribution Paladins, Shadow Priests are in the same boat. If there's a class that has a really high skill ceiling or is harder to play, there's really no ground to go to for a person who really loves that class but doesn't necessarily like the DPS rotation or thinks it's much too hard. So often we will intentionally kind of leave those specializations in that kind of easier to master design spaces. And in terms of how we see that for Retribution Paladin, like you have mentioned, the DPS rotation, while that's a bit easier to execute, Ret Paladins we feel have a huge ceiling in terms of the utility that they can utilize, right? Throwing that clutch lay on hands, or putting a Blessing of Freedom at the right time on your healer who's maybe stuck in some ground poop, or other really interesting, unique utility that class brings to the table. Having an easier to execute DPS rotation allows you a bit more bandwidth, to look around for opportunities to take advantage of that utility and all those really cool buttons that they bring to the table. So that's really where we feel like a lot of that expression for mastery comes into play for that class. Hey, that is awesome to hear that you're happy with where Pharaoh Druids are right now. I know there's actually quite a few people on the team and even people on the classic combat team that play Pharaoh Druids and have a passion for it. So they've always got an eye on it. And in terms of future changes, that's definitely feedback I'll take to the team and especially pass along to the community team. We always try to make sure that when we're making changes, the intention is clear. But I know sometimes, we call them buff nerfs, right? Where there's a buff to one thing and a nerf on another, and you're like, are you trying to buff us or nerf us, or what's the goal here? So we always try to make sure that the intent of the changes is clear, and if that's not coming across, it sounds like we can do better. So I'll take that feedback back to the team. Yeah, Rogue is always a fun one to discuss. They have such unique play styles and also unique fantasy, right? Like Outlaw is almost that more swashbuckling. Subtlety is really focusing on subtlety, right? Like stealth mechanics, which often leads to major burst. And then Assassination is kind of that, like, also has actually turned into a more burst damage class, but they're also a bit more slower paced and methodical, where Outlaw Rogue, to use maybe a bad analogy, I sometimes feel like I'm playing like Dance Dance Revolution on my keyboard, right? Like it's just very frenetic feel. So just the fantasy and the feeling of all the specs, really, we want to make sure that they're unique. And in terms of Outlaw Rogues and what we could do better there, it sounds like the target caps is definitely an interesting one. We talk a lot about strengths and weaknesses, and especially with a class that has 3 DPS specs, that can be a bit more challenging to make sure it's clear between them. I do want to say, I would say, look to the hotfix notes, and I want to say that there was actually quite a few bug fixes that have gone out recently, as well as in the most recent 11.15 update, that rogues will hopefully see a lot of improvements based on. Like, for instance, this is a weird one, but Blade Flurry was actually trying to hit dead targets, and there's a lot of that in Mythic Plus where they should feel really strong. So that's something that maybe felt like you might be underperforming, and it was hard to understand why. Well, we figured out the bug and fixed it recently. So hopefully a lot of that feels a lot better after the most recent updates. So thank you. That's awesome to hear that you're happy with where Demon Hunters are currently. We know that they're a really popular specialization, and or class rather, and they're really fun to play. Their unique movement abilities, it almost feels like an action combat class, so it's always really cool to see people enjoying them. Vengeance is definitely really strong right now. Tank balance generally is something we want to keep an eye on. We know that was an area where we got a lot of feedback from in the War Within Season 1, where it felt like the tank availability, or what the different viable options were, was a bit too limiting. So we want to make sure we're keeping on top of that for Season 2. So we'll definitely look out for that. And in terms of bugs, I assume you're talking about Aldraki. I would be curious to understand specifically which bugs you meant, so please feel free to pass that along to the community team, and it'll make it our way. But I will for sure follow up with the team on that one as well, just to see if some of those are on their radar. Death Knights are always a fun one to have in your group. I cannot express how many times Death Grip has saved our butts, especially in Mythic Plus. When there's somebody who we need, like a caster who we need to get in the group, is pretty common in a lot of our Mythic Plus dungeons. And in terms of what an area of focus for the group would be in terms of your feedback, I've historically, Frost has always been a very proc dependent class, and that's something that we think is unique to Frost, and it's an interesting, almost more reactive way of playing that spec. But if you feel like Unholy is moving too much in that direction, it's for sure something the team can take a look at. We always are talking about different ways to distinguish our specs, and Frost and Unholy have felt like they've always had a very unique spaces for those two. Unholy is almost more about that army and having that vibe of being that that Death Knight with an army behind them. So we'll for sure take a look at that one next time we're looking to more clearly define the design spaces, which sometimes when we have larger, almost more identity defining changes, we think of those as being more relevant on expansion boundaries versus something that we would change in a hotfix. So depending on the breadth of the change that might be required there, it would at times dictate the timing. But either way, we can definitely take a look at that. Balanced Druids are a really fun one. They have such good, we call it split cleave, as in like when you have to DPS a lot of targets, but they're like not on top of each other, right? Like a lot of our melee DPS classes really excel at that, but balanced druids have that really unique niche of like, yeah, if things are really spread out, they're really good at doing damage to a lot of them. So it was actually quite a popular spec in the race for World First, and I know there was actually a couple of nerfs we had to make, especially on Mythic difficulty, because balanced druids, if you didn't have one in your Mythic raid, it could feel so punishing. So, you know, we do want to make sure that their AoE damage is really strong. It is one of the major strengths of the spec, but sometimes it can actually cause tuning problems at the very high end. So glad to hear they're in a good spot in terms of AoE damage at this point. And in terms of single target damage, I know going into the 11.15 update, we actually did do, I want to say, about a 4% buff to single target balanced druids damage. So, you know, not enough to put them in that upper echelon of single target damage, because we really feel like AoE is where their strengths should lie, and let's make sure that they're really good in those situations. But, you know, there is a point where, you know, your weakness, if your single target damage is too low, it starts to feel really unfair. So we wanted to make sure that it didn't ever feel, you know, unfair. So we wanted to give him a good buff recently. That's awesome to hear that there are viable options for Shadow Priests with the hero talents. That's always something that the team is looking to make sure that there are options there, as we always want to give different playstyle choices some viability with those. And in terms of the, you know, kind of core talent choices and the conflicts between picking up spells like silence or damage, you know, sometimes having a choice between damage and utility can be valuable and can work. But I do think the team has tried to make it easier for those like really critical talents like a kick to be easier to pick up without having to feel like you're giving up on damaging talents. So that's definitely something we can take a look at. And in terms of, you know, the ability to kind of have more margin for error in the spec, yeah, that's absolutely something I agree with. Priests are, you know, a class that only has one DPS spec. So, you know, we try to make sure that classes that only have one option versus having multiple DPS options, to make sure that those are a bit more forgiving. So that's definitely great feedback there, and also something I can take back to the team and look at. So yeah, very much appreciate the feedback. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you noticed that Windwalker's single target was really, really strong. We've definitely had an eye on that during the race world first, and I believe we've made a couple of tuning passes at this point as part of our kind of normal tuning change schedule. So Windwalker's definitely got some adjustments there. And in terms of the bug fixes, I know that we were looking at a slicing winds fix a little while ago, but if there are other bugs to look into, I'll definitely bring that to the team's attention and see if we can get some of that stuff addressed as well. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. Glad to hear that Marks is doing well in AoE. I know they actually had quite a large redesign. There's a lot of marksman hunter and hunter changes in the Undermined update, and you know, anytime we do large updates like that, there's usually some tuning kind of aftermath that needs to happen. And I know there's been quite a few tuning passes since the race world first ended, and looking at kind of some of the most recent data, it looks like hunters, both marks and survival, actually are doing pretty well in the raid, especially. You know, they're in kind of that top tier echelon of especially range specs. So it feels like they're in a pretty good place after some of the tuning changes that have taken place. So hopefully the community's a bit happier with where they are now versus where they started out at the beginning of the update. Yeah, I'm glad you noticed. Yes, Devastation especially had a lot of representation in the race for World First, and even today they're really, really strong on live. You know, after the 11.15 update, I think they're still one of, if not the strongest DPS specs, especially in the raid. And they also bring a ton of utility. You know, they have that kind of mid-range unique niche, but you know that means they need to also have quite a few strengths. And in terms of hero talent representation, yeah, it's something that the team is always kind of keeping an eye on and making sure that players feel like they can kind of pick and choose between the playstyle that they prefer, so that the tuning of those is in the ballpark from one another. So that's definitely something that we'd like to keep an eye on, and also probably need to keep an eye on Devastation to make sure it doesn't get too far ahead. And I know you didn't mention augmentation, but you know, there was a lot of changes with augmentation, and we definitely feel like there's room for them to be buffed once again. But given how strong they were for so long, it's something that we want to be a bit more conservative as we approach buffs to that spec. So thank you for the awesome feedback. Yeah, definitely. We have looked at all of our class tier sets, especially within the Undermined update. It's one of those interesting things where tuning sometimes, it's a matter of, is it the core class that we need to look at, or are the tier sets a bit behind? Because certainly there are tier sets that can be significant outliers in terms of how well they're performing, which can put the whole class out of balance for a patch, when in reality the core class is quite fine. The tier set is a little behind, so the tier set is definitely something that the team often looks at in terms of tuning, and that would be potentially a good place for us to look at in the not too distant future. So I'll for sure take the feedback back to the team, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear, which spec is, more viable depending on the set bonuses. Hopefully by now everyone's got all of their 4-piece set bonuses, as we're a good ways through the season. And it's great to hear that you feel like, both are viable once you get your set bonuses rolling. And in terms of the feedback of the design of Frost is too complex, yeah, I definitely know that, proc management, especially with Frost, where you have both Fingers of Frost and Brain Freeze, that you're kind of managing that aspect of the specs. Sometimes it can feel a little overwhelming and you're not really sure, or it's not obvious what you should be doing at what time. We actually recently just announced a cool feature about a rotation helper, which hopefully will help people kind of help sort out how they should prioritize spell priority when they have different procs up. So that's a feature we're excited to see, and I definitely think Frost Mages would benefit from that. And also to the feedback about the set bonuses, especially the Fire one being a little bit out of band. Yeah, that's something we always try to be careful of, we don't want it to feel like the spec is overpowered, when in reality it's just the set bonus for that tier might be a bit out of line compared to other specs. So whenever we do our pretty frequent tuning passes, whether or not to look at the core spec or just the set bonus for that tier is definitely an area that comes up quite often. So definitely appreciate the hint to look in that direction there, and we'll keep an eye on that moving forward. Thank you. Thank you all so much for having me. It was really awesome to see the results of your Mythic Plus Dungeon event and Target Dummy Challenge. I really appreciate the enthusiasm and passion of the Chinese community. You all are amazing, and we really appreciate you joining us in the Undermined. So thank you so much again, and thank you for having me.